Yes, good evening, everybody. Photography Live and Uncut. It's Friday evening. A little bit of a change to my schedule, but that's because I've got such an important guest this week. Absolutely delighted. It's going to be a difficult interview for me because I just love the history of photography. I think I might just hand the mic over to my guest and just let him talk. It's Jeff Curto. Welcome to my show, Jeff.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me. This is great. Middle of the afternoon here in Chicago, where I'm based, or Chicago suburbs, but evening where you are. So
that's right.
Glad to be here.
It's 8:05. Thank you so much for joining us. Yes, you're in Chicago. That obviously was going to be my next question. Whereabouts are you from? Well, you're just in the suburbs of Chicago. Let's just get a geographical connection where you are, Jeff.
I'm right now. I'm in Batavia, Illinois, which is in the far west suburbs. I'm looking out a window beyond the computer here at the Fox River, which runs right past where I live, and so I'm far western suburbs of Chicago.
Okay, that's super. Dare I ask the question, being a bit of an American football fan myself, is it the Chicago Bears or is it Green Bay Packers?
It is the Chicago Bears here.
It is the Bears.
Okay. The mortal enemy.
We won't talk anymore then about American football.
So,
lovely.
Well, at this time of the year, we've got hockey and basketball playoffs going on, and both Chicago teams are in the hunt. So
that's good to hear. And the baseball season just started as well.
Baseball season's just started. Typically a lot of enthusiasm and not very much success in baseball in Chicago, but still my favorite American sport.
Yeah, I love to watch it over here as well. I think baseball is just such a great game. Really enjoy watching it. Jeff, let's go right back to the beginning. What's your first recollection of a camera?
It's actually funny. I've got I'll see if I can dig it up here, and can we use this chat window here to put links into?
Yeah, sure.
But it's a story that I told using digital storytelling, which I think probably we'll get to digital storytelling at least sometime during this conversation. But when I was about 8 years old, I caught my first fish. Now, I fished as a little kid, like a lot of little kids do, and I never became any kind of an angler of any sort. But I remember catching my first fish, and my father, who had been very interested and involved in photography, I get home with the fish, which was like this long, and my father says, hold the fish out in front of you, so that it'll look bigger in the picture as he's about to take a picture of me. And so I did. And, a week or so later, the pictures came back from the photo store. And by golly, if that fish, which was only a few inches long, looked like it was almost as big as I was. And I just thought that was the coolest thing ever. Like the whole idea of, wow, you can take a picture of something that isn't what it really seems to be. And I was really fascinated by the idea of that sort of trick that my father played with the camera, knowing what was going to happen in terms of perspective. And from that point, I sort of borrowed a Kodak Brownie camera from my mother, who wasn't using it anymore, I guess, and started making photographs with that camera, and just began to document what was around me back in the days of film. Of course, I learned how to be, at least after a short while, after my parents sort of grew frustrated with the amount of money that I was spending. I grew to be a little bit more economical about what I photographed, and didn't photograph quite everything that I saw. But that was really the start of it, and it really had to do with that experience of having my dad take a picture of me with my first fish, a northern pike.
I was just going to say, it's surprising. And from an angler's point of view, you've actually taken the fish home. Did you put it on the plate to eat?
No. I think that I don't. Well, it's a really good question. I don't think we did. And
If you did, your mum didn't tell you.
No, yeah, exactly. So
probably made up a nice fish pie and you thought it was chicken.
Entirely possible. Yeah, I think I probably wouldn't have wanted to eat the thing that I just.
No. If it's anything like pike over in this country, it probably would have tasted like chicken. A fairly tough old meaty fish, from what I can remember. Yeah. So from your first experience, this brownie, what was the first camera that you bought?
Well, I then kind of got very excited about a particular camera. This is a really, sort of an interesting story that actually kind of plays to advice of professionals, right? Mm. So it was about the time that 110 cartridge cameras were coming out when I was an early teen, like 10 or 12 years old. And Minolta had either Minolta or Pentax. They had a fairly sophisticated 110 camera where you could adjust aperture and shutter speed and so forth and so on. And so I went to the camera store, and it was like my birthday or something, and my parents were going to help me. I'd been saving some money. They were going to help me buy a camera, and I went to the camera store, and the guy at the camera store sort of said, if you're really interested in photography, you don't really want this. And he pulls out this Yashica GX35, I think is what it was.
Was it
and it was a rangefinder fixed lens
camera
that I think has sort of returned now. It's like a camera you can buy on the marketplace again, because I saw one and just swooned over it, because it was my, and this guy said, here's why, and he showed me the size of the negative versus the size of the negative in the 35 millimeter camera, and he said, you'll be much more pleased with the results. And so now I had a camera that was, semi-manual. It had aperture priority, I think, and maybe not shutter priority, and maybe manual mode. And that was the first camera that I owned, that I chose. And I think I had assistance from my parents with that. And then a few years later, I bought an Olympus OM1.
Yeah, beautiful camera.
I've always sort of been interested in the thing that's sort of just a little ahead of the curve, because the Olympus OM1 was the first of the smaller single lens reflex cameras. Prior to that time, it had been the big giant Nikons that were big and heavy and you could pound a nail in with, and the OM1 was much smaller and much lighter, and so I bought one of those, and then I ended up with, I still have several of them.
Yeah.
Bodies that I used professionally over a number of years. So, and that was my entry point into the 35 millimeter area. And I stayed there with Olympus gear in the 35 millimeter arena. And then, like a lot of photographers, especially in the film days, moved into medium format with, first twin lens reflex, Yashica matte, and then Rolleiflex, and then Hasselblad, and then eventually bought a large format camera, which is the camera that I probably used most, my 4x5 Deerdorf. So
yeah, we'll come to that Deerdorf later on, because I'm personally, I've never used one. It's something which I'm really getting interested in because of a couple of interviews I've had with some people. But going back to the Yashica, you're right in terms of this latest phase where people are I've got to get one of these rangefinder type cameras. I bought one. Unfortunately, I didn't put film in it straight away, and about 3 weeks later, when I did use it, I found that it in actual fact was broken.
Oh no!
Yeah, so unfortunately, 50 pounds as sterling has been washed down the drain. Basically, I've get it repaired, but it is beyond repair. So that's a shame.
That's too bad.
It's
a cool looking little camera.
It'll make a nice ornament on the shelf. That's what I'm going to say, alongside my Nikons.
Or if you've got one of those doors that doesn't stay open properly.
Yeah, exactly. So that's interesting. So you got into the Olympus, the OM, and I nearly said OMD then, because of course that's the digital version of those cameras now. And I do remember when a friend bought one of these OM ones, and that super little camera that came out and really, as you say, started a little bit of a move towards smaller cameras, although still 35 millimeter and super cameras, the Olympus set. So what can I just ask respectfully, what sort of age are you now with in terms of your camera gear that you're talking, not your present age, but the camera gear that you had then, when you've just got the, we'll say at the Olympus point?
So I was, at the time of the Olympus, I was probably 16.
Okay.
16-ish. High school here in the U.S., sort of the middle of the pre-university time for a U.S. student, and I was involved in the high school newspaper and yearbook, making photographs for them. And
this is what I was going to ask. When actually did photography really start taking a hold? It sounds around about this sort of time. You're taking photographs now for basically the college.
Right.
High school newspaper.
High school, I don't know what the equivalent would be.
Well, it's just basically from ours. We would call it a secondary modern or a grammar school over in this country.
So, and I had some advantages in that my dad had been involved in photography a little bit and had a dark room in the basement of a house that we lived in, and then at about that time when I got that Olympus camera, we moved to a different house, and he helped me build a little dark room under the staircase, kind of a Harry Potter-esque kind of a, when I think about how small that dark room was now, it was really literally right underneath the staircase to the basement.
Yeah.
That was but it was a great little space for me to get away and develop film and make some prints and so forth. So I did that at about that same time period. And I was just talking with somebody yesterday, a photographer friend yesterday. We were sort of comparing notes about when we thought of ourselves as photographers. When you sort of make that decision, oh, now from this moment, I'm a photographer. And I think it was about 18 or so for me.
Okay.
When I realized really that that was going to be something that was going to be an important part of every day of your life.
And going from high school into college, the decision had been made you were going to study photography at college.
Well, actually, the decision was made that I was going to study English, English language. I'd always been interested in reading and writing, and so I was going to be an English major. And I had become friends with the guy who was the head of the art school, and we were walking across campus one day, and he said, "Have you picked out a major yet?" And I said, "Yeah, I think I'm going to be an English major." And he stopped me, grabbed me by both shoulders,
really,
and turned me around, and he said, in more colorful language than I'll use here, "What in the world do you want to do that for?"
Yeah.
And he said, "You're a photographer." And because he'd seen my photographs, and we talked a lot about photography, and he was a photographer, and a guy named John Mulvaney, tremendous influence on me. And he literally grabbed me and squared me off and said, "What in the world do you want to do that for?" And I said, "Well, what do you think?" He said, "You should be an art major." And I said, "Well, what kind of job can I get with an art major?" And he said, "The same kind of job that you won't be able to get with an English major, but you'll have a lot more fun in art school."
Yeah.
Scratched my head and thought, he's probably right.
Yeah.
So it was at that point that I changed my major that was about my sophomore year or so of second year of college, and changed my major to art, and started taking art classes, drawing and painting and sculpture and printmaking and all those kinds of things in addition to photography, which I thought was, in retrospect, very important to do that, and art history. Which also became an important component of what I sort of ended up as. So I wound up then getting a Bachelor of Fine Arts in art with a concentration in photography, and then going on from there to get a Master of Fine Arts in photography from a school called Bennington College in Vermont.
Fantastic. And what happened after? I call it university. You guys call it college. What happened after university, work-wise? Where did you end up?
Well, of course, like many people just fresh out of a master's degree program, I wound up at home living with my parents. I've
got two here. Don't worry about it.
I have college age kids. Actually, one who's a graduate, college graduate now, and he's not living at home with his mother or his father. So I've got that as a thumbs up. So I started applying for teaching positions, but there were not many, few and far between. And I started then working as a professional photographer, and I did any number of things, weddings and portraits, and lots and lots of corporate events where I take pictures at corporate parties. Just about any product photography. I did a lot of architectural interiors and exteriors for architects and designers, and photographing all sorts of things. Anything that would come to me, or I would find that would help pay the bills and help get me out from and I obviously I loved my parents, but at some point in life you need to move on.
Some money. I can
So
understand
earned my money, and started to get out into the world and worked in photo labs and making custom black and white enlargements and making custom color enlargements, and worked at a photo lab where I ran a mini lab type machine that was very common in the late 1980s or mid 1980s, where people would take their film and get multiple copies of their 3x5 inch pictures made, and so forth and so on. So I did all of those things, like wedding photographer and portrait photographer, and all of that stuff. And ultimately that sort of parlayed itself into a job teaching photography at a community college here in the Chicago suburbs called College of DuPage. And I taught there for 30 years. I'm just retired from there about a year ago.
Yeah, but before we get into College of DuPage, just want to ask you a very quick question there, because that diversity of photography you're doing there, portraiture, wedding, architectural type work, that can't surely be done with just one camera, because I can see a fantastic image sitting behind you there on the wall, beautiful perpendicular uprights, etc. Just briefly, if you wouldn't mind, Jeff, tell us what sort of equipment you were using in your professional career at that time.
The old adage, if all you have is a hammer, you tend to think of everything as a nail. You can put a screw into the wall with a hammer, but it's hard. It's easier to do with a screwdriver. And so at some point, especially in my graduate school years, I discovered, didn't discover, but I guess I had it beaten into me in a way by my instructors, that what was necessary was the right tool for the right job. So medium format cameras for formal portraiture, large format cameras for things like architectural subjects where you needed to put uprights upright, and so forth and so on. And all of those kinds of things began to become part of my arsenal, and that you needed to learn how to do lighting, because you couldn't always depend on light being what you wanted it to be, and you needed to be able to do it with hot lights and with electronic flash, and all of those things are parts of the photographer's puzzle. It's always frustrating to me when I see a photographer say, I never really wanted, I don't want to sully my work by using artificial light. I was like, well, if you have to photograph something that's in a dark place and it's moving, you're going to have some trouble doing that without artificial light. So so I started to expand my repertoire. I had done a couple of fine art projects in my undergraduate years and my graduate school years that had required large format cameras, and I had used the school's equipment. And somewhere in the middle of my graduate school time, I bought a 4x5 camera of my own and one lens, and then eventually augmented it with several other lenses. And as a professional, I used a ton of rental equipment. It's one of the things that's so much easier now. and I assume that in the UK there are probably
Yeah.
rental houses that mail things to you and so forth. And here in the Chicago area, we have had rental houses where you can actually go and pick up the equipment. But lots and lots of rental equipment for things that you don't need to use. You don't need to own.
You don't need them all the time, do you?
Right. You don't need it all the time,
Yeah.
and it's something that you can pass along the cost to a client. Because it's a piece of equipment you must have to be able to do the job.
Right.
And ultimately, in a lot of cases, it's much cheaper in the long run and in the short run to rent the equipment rather than to purchase it. So.
That really is a great tip, actually, Jeff. A friend of mine has just started. He said he's going to set up himself as a professional photographer in Scotland, and he listed out the equipment. And I thought that's going to cost you quite a bit of money. He wasn't buying an expensive camera by any stretch of the imagination, but everything else that he'd labeled, he wanted this, that lens, and this lighting gear, and that. I'm thinking, whoa. So I just put a little note in there. Think about hiring. It's so much simpler to get yourself started, isn't it, rather than having all this gear.
I rented Hasselblad equipment for years and years and years before I actually bought any, because I couldn't afford to buy it. It was too expensive. But I knew that what it was that it could do was far superior than what I could do with my twin lens equipment that I had at the time that was medium format. And the optical quality was so good, and the different types of bodies that you could use, and flex body Hasselblad equipment. So I would rent all that stuff simply because it was the right tool for the right job. And
as you say, you quite rightly said there, you write it off against the customer's cost. You price it into the job. Makes it so much easier. So much easier. Okay, let's right. We're now into College of DuPage. And I think for me, this is where the story really starts, because I became familiar with your podcasts. But let's just talk through, because I think one of the unique things you did, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Jeff, what you decided to do was to record the lectures that you were giving to the students and actually put them out on the podcast. Is that right?
That's exactly right. So what happened was in 2005, a particular, and I'll back up and say that one of the first classes that I started teaching at this institution was history of photography in 1989, 1990, no, earlier than that, 1984, 85 is when I started teaching the history of photography. And I'd had a background in it in graduate school, and I'd had, I'd taken my lumps in art history, so I had enough of the toolkit to be able to make it happen. But somewhere around 2005, I had a particular class where a particular group of students in the class all were going to go on a field trip for another class on the exact day that I had a history class. And I wasn't able to change the class time. So I said to them, well, I'll tell you what, I've got a little portable recording device, and I'll just record the lecture, because they didn't want to miss the lecture. But at the same time, they didn't want to miss the opportunity. I think it was going to a professional photographer's studio with a class that was dealing with the business of photography. So I said, I'll record this, and I'll put it up on the internet for you to download and listen to. So I did that. I did that 1 week, and a couple of students who were in the class and didn't go on the field trip said, well, that was really great to be able to go back and listen to the class session again, because I'm not able to take notes on everything that you say, and so forth and so on. So I started recording the class sessions, and it was right about the time that podcasting was becoming kind of a thing. And I had started to listen to some podcasts on my own, and I thought, oh, well, why don't I just put this up as a podcast? And so I started doing it as just an audio podcast with just an audio stream. And then I hit upon a piece of software that allowed me to coincidentally record the slides that I was showing from my, I use Apple's Keynote application instead of PowerPoint, but PowerPoint-like application. And it made a sort of static slideshow that could be published as what was called an enhanced podcast.
That's right. Yeah.
In the early days of podcasting, there were audio podcasts and then these enhanced podcasts, and bandwidth really wasn't available, and technology hadn't caught up to even the idea of doing what we're doing right now, video
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
conferencing. So I used the enhanced podcast method for a while, and then eventually started screencasting the slideshows using Camtasia screen capture software, and then putting them out there as video podcasts. So, and I initially really planned on sort of thinking about this as something that students in my class could use. And I figured, maybe, 20 students in the class would use it. Maybe another 25 or 30 people in the outside world might find it interesting. And, much to my amazement, 10 to 15,000 people a week were eventually downloading these things, which kind of stunned me. And in fact, I was hosting the files on the college's server, and the IT department phoned me up one day and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And they said, "Well, you have these files, and they're being downloaded thousands of times.
Wow.
What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm podcasting." And our IT department said, "What is podcasting?
What is a podcast?" Yeah.
So I sent them a couple of links so that they understood. They weren't complaining. They were just kind of trying to figure out why the XML file that was the podcast feed was getting almost as many hits as the college's homepage.
Amazing.
And they couldn't figure out what was, what's this one guy doing?
This all comes around basically because when I spoke to Brooks Jensen, Brooks basically of Lenswork, he started off very much the same way with his short 5-7 minute podcast. He put it up on the stream. Then, of course, Apple came up with this great idea of iTunes, and podcast was born. And, of course, that gave him the filter out. But the link that I know you through really is the link, obviously, with Chris Marquardt, Martin Bailey, and John Arnold, who also basically started up relatively around about the same sort of time. I think Chris, in actual fact, is the old.
Yeah, he's our progenitor, right? I think he started in maybe 2004.
Yeah,
something like that. Very early on in so I started this history of photography podcast, and then I started looking at the rest of the photography podcast world, and realized that there were an awful lot of podcasts talking about gear and about Photoshop and about technology of photography, but I realized that there wasn't anybody really talking about creative photography. And so I started to augment the History of Photography podcast, I think in 2006, with one that I call Camera Position, where I talk more about the process of how somebody goes about making photographs, what thought process somebody goes through. And what I've discovered through both the History of Photography podcast and Camera Position is that there are a lot of people in the world who would have liked to have been able to have the kind of background of a Bachelor of Fine Arts and a Master of Fine Arts in photography, but through whatever life vagaries threw at them, or whatever vagaries life threw at them, rather, they ended up going to school for completely different things and have this tremendous interest in photography and don't have access to those kinds of ideas. So. So it's been really nice to be able to have this sort of little section of the podcast sphere to talk about more of the sort of soft skills of photography more than the hard skills.
Yeah. But going back to the history side of it, I think basically what in actual fact you produced there, Jeff, is so important for people, especially like myself, that are sort of, okay, I went through the film days and then now I'm sort of more digital now, but it's so important for us to know and realize the skills and the abilities of what the, dare I use the term, old-time photographers had. I'm talking about the Cartier-Bressons and the Bressards that immediately come to mind, and I'm sure from your knowledge of it, there are so many more. But it's so important, isn't it, that we must take note and realize the skill that these photographers had in those days.
Well, I've always sort of ascertained and talked about the idea that you can't know where you're going until you know where you've been.
Yeah.
And our notions about what photography is for, how we utilize photography, how we tell somebody about a person or a place or a thing.
Mhm.
Um, we're not really ever inventing a new wheel. We're always just sort of putting a new spoke into the wheel. We're always
Yeah,
sort of
that's a very good point.
we're always kind of putting a variation on a theme. As I started to learn the history of photography way back when, I began to recognize that pretty much everything anybody wanted to photograph had been photographed within the first 30 years or so.
Yeah.
Everything from underwater to the heavens through telescopes, and everything that existed on the earth
Mhm.
that anybody had ever seen had been photographed. And so then I began to think, well, every photograph that I make of this place, whatever this place is, or this person, or this event, or whatever, I'm really just sort of adding to the overall life experience of photographs of that particular
Yeah.
person, place, or thing.
Yeah.
So, and I think those lessons that we learn from what came before us are really important. And they're important not just from the visual aspect of looking at what it is that people have photographed, but also from the point of view of learning about what successful photographers have done.
Yeah.
What have they done? How have they worked? And how have they approached the medium in ways that have fed them both, emotionally, as well as in terms of financial compensation.
Putting
So,
money on the table. Exactly.
you know,
Whilst this career now has developed for you with your teaching side of things, I get the impression now, looking at your websites, there's an dare I use the term trend, of projects that you've developed through the years. Tell me how the projects developed, Jeff.
well, golly, that's and I in a sense that sort of hinges off of what I was just talking about with how photographers work. And it's hard to look at the history of the medium and not notice
Mm.
that most photographers, over the course of their careers, while they may start out photographing lots and lots of different things, or they may photograph this particular thing and then that particular thing and then the next particular thing, typically what they do is photograph something for a period of time.
Yeah.
Whether it's we'll just pick two obvious examples of Ansel Adams photographing the natural world,
Hmm.
or Edward Weston photographing in sort of consecutive times or all at once, but building several different bodies of work in, say, nude photography, still life photography,
Yeah.
landscape photography, portrait photography, and
Mhm.
kind of building those separate pieces over time. That you begin to recognize that working in the project in project can really help you focus your attention on something.
Yeah.
It can really help you in terms of what it is that you want to communicate as a photographer. The more you think about and research what that topic is, what it is that you're photographing and what it is that other people have written about it or photographed about it, and doing that research and finding out what your subject really is can help you define how you're going to photograph it and what parts of its story you want to communicate. As a photographer, that's a lot of what I have done is created projects that are based around interests that I have. Probably the biggest and most significant one is Italian architecture, Italian
Yeah.
structure, and that by itself is something that I'm very interested in, and have done a lot of research and reading about and
Mm.
study of, and kind of interestingly, some of the stuff that I ignored probably in my art history classes way back in my college years ends up becoming super important as I study the
Yeah. It's
history
funny.
of
It's funny how it comes.
architecture of things. So
Yeah.
so those kinds of things become a really important part of of how I approach the medium and how I approach sort of thinking through something from the beginning. And that is not to say that I'm not like many other photographers that, you know, I went to, I had an event that I was, a photo competition that I was judging in Chicago yesterday, and I brought along a little camera and made some photographs along the way of just interesting things that I saw that probably have no particular bearing on anything, but it's, you know, that's sort of like taking a little, you know, not, instead of sitting down for a full course meal, you know, just taking a little nibble along the way. Here's something interesting. Here's something interesting. So I don't let that impact how I do photography in my everyday world. But it, you know, in terms of projects, I think that's a really important way for photographers to think about things, and making more photographs of smaller numbers of things rather than the opposite, which is to make, you know, lots of photographs or a few photographs of lots of different things.
I know where you're coming from, because you can basically get stuck in one particular mold, can't you? And then the other bits, which you could well be just as good at doing, you're out of practice. You can't do it. A good friend of mine is a fantastic still life photographer, but when it comes around to asking her to do a decent landscape photograph, she lacks that skill, and that's probably because she hasn't practiced it.
That's you know, that's a super important part of this, is that, you know, if there are photographers listening who studied music at some point, you know, one of the things that I've always been intrigued by is how many photographers have been musicians.
That's right.
Ansel Adams, Paul Caponegro, you know, great musicians who come to photography with that, and they understand the, you know, but even, you know, even somebody like me who played piano poorly and guitar even more poorly as a young person, understanding the aspect of practicing.
Exactly right.
Practicing. What is it, you know, what does it do to practice? You know, I just, I teach workshops in Italy every summer, and I just sent out some information to the people who will be going to Italy with me in about a month, 3 weeks, about, you know, just practicing with their cameras. You know, which direction do you turn this dial to change the aperture?
Exactly.
And in which direction do you change the aperture to make a smaller hole? And in which direction do you move the dial to make a bigger hole?
Yeah.
Can you do that without having to think, oh, if I turn the thumb wheel this way, is it bigger or is it smaller? But you need to be able to know that in a kind of intrinsic
But that just
way.
that doesn't apply to just musicians or photographers, does it? Before I forget, I want to come back to Ansel Adams. It doesn't just apply to photographers and musicians. It applies to sportsmen. We were talking about baseball players, and American footballers, and golfers is actually classic. They need to go out and practice on the fairway, so that basically when they're playing in tournament and that shot is going to count for thousands of dollars, it comes as second nature.
And I'll take it back the other direction too. You know, your local coffee shop and the barista who works there. When you watch one of these guys, or a chef, or, you know, anybody who is doing something on a regular basis, their muscle memory is so ingrained in what it is that they're doing. They don't really have to think about the process of what it is that they're doing. They just do it.
Exactly.
And that then allows that whole creative side of things to come to the foreground, because when all of the sort of ginchy bits, you know, the pieces that are just mechanical are, you know, sort of buried in the way back. Now you can do a lot more stuff. So.
Yeah, exactly. I just very briefly before we go to screen share, because I want to show your work now with regards to the projects you've been doing in Italy. You were very fortunate to go to the last presentation, I believe, by Ansel Adams.
It's true.
What was that like?
Oh, it was, you know, I was just thinking about it today, because somebody posted a photograph on Facebook of David Hume Kennerly photographing Adams for a Time magazine cover, and I was sort of reminiscing about that and talking with some other people on Facebook who had known Adams. So in 1983, I went to an Ansel Adams workshop, and of course, Adams is so well known as a photographer, and perhaps equally known, especially to photographers of my generation, as an instructor. Wrote a tremendous series of books about photography and the technology of photography that were very important to many of us in my generation growing up, and not having this kind of resource like we're using right now to learn photography from. And he also taught workshops over many years, and was very generous with his time in terms of sharing his expertise with photographers. And of course, Earth Day just having happened, it is worth mentioning that Ansel Adams is probably equally, or should be equally well known for his devotion to preserving the natural world, using photography to help preserve the natural world and have people recognize the value of what we have in the natural world. So, but he was exactly as you might suspect if you've ever read anything that he's written, or seen his photographs that convey a real love for the natural world. He was very generous. He was incredibly funny. He he had a pair of eyeglasses. He had these sort of stereotypical eyeglasses. When you see a photograph of Adams, you always see him in his eyeglasses, but he had a pair that he would whip out that didn't have any lenses in them, so that if somebody was photographing him, they didn't have to deal with the glare on the
light
of the glasses. So a photographer aware of what other photographers' challenges were. I thought that was great. At his home, everything stopped precisely at the stroke of 5 o'clock for cocktail hour. So there was no more work to be done after 5 o'clock, because cocktail hour was a sacrosanct and important piece of every day. And he was just incredibly. He was very generous with his time. Very generous with telling all the stories that we know about Adams, but telling them for the 150th time as if it was the first time. And also a really gentle critic, gentle but persuasive critic in terms of how he approached talking about what it was that you had made as a photographer. What the work looked like, but letting you know what he thought, but not kicking your ass too hard in the process.
No, not destroying it. Not destroying it.
Exactly.
I remember seeing a video of him once where, in actual fact, he put the nearly dry print that he'd just done in his darkroom into a microwave to speed up the drying process, and then he just got this curl.
That was only for. He showed us that, and it was only for checking the dry down factor of the print. And then he would go back once he found out that was, that the white was going to be the white that he wanted it to be. Then he'd go back and, so he wasn't actually drying the prints in the microwave. They were all air dried on screens in the darkroom.
Amazing. As I go to screen share, I've asked this question before when I interviewed Ted Forbes. I really wonder what he would think of the present age, where he can develop so many images using Lightroom or Aperture, and I think he would have just had a ball.
He was aware of the sort of coming, he knew that the digital era was just getting there, and he had played with a Quantel paint box, which was an early progenitor of Photoshop, and he talked about how he had seen somebody with that technology be able to go into a photograph and remove the lines from telephone wires, and about how there were so many photographs that he wished that he had made, knowing now that technology was available to be able to sort of quickly whisk away that line and not have to worry that line was there. And so he was excited, but he also knew that, and he was going to he didn't know that he was going to die a year or so later, but he knew he had had heart trouble his entire life, and he knew that he wasn't probably going to live to be 105. So he recognized that he wasn't going to be able to see this technology, but he was very excited about the potential of
exactly. Yeah. Let's go to screen share, Jeff, because I want to share your work. I'm hoping this is going to come up shortly. You'll be able to see it.
I can see it.
You can see it now. Great.
Yeah.
I've got to operate it from the screen behind. So just bear with me a second while I just get rid of that. Go to this. Okay, so for those that are going to be listening to the podcast at a later date, we're now gone to a screen share where we're sharing Jeff's project of Italian architecture. And direct me in the right place here, Jeff. I think if I go to evidence of hands-on stone,
link, the Italian portfolio evidence of hands-on stone is where you should find the body of work that I've been fortunate enough to exhibit a lot, sell some of, publish in Lenswork magazine, although it was published under a different name in Lenswork. It was published under the early name for the project, which was Bella Luce, or Beautiful Light. But as I worked through studying about the process of building these buildings and the time that they had been around and the various layers that they had accumulated over time, I began to recognize that it was not only the architects who planned the structures themselves, but also the artisans who created these objects, and then the people who used them, and the tremendous interest that I had as a photographer in the buildings was really built up over time by these hands manipulating stone, various types and sorts. So the project became evidence of hands-on stone, with a sort of subtitle or super title, the Italian portfolio, so that everybody knows where it comes from. So
I'm just going to click through, and when you just make your comments as you're seeing the images, and if I go too fast, tell me to go back, and we can talk a little bit further about a particular image.
So these are all made.
This image here, which is just basically, I find I'm so fortunate in the interviews that I've had with people, because I look at their work, and there are so many images which I see on these presentations where I would never have taken this photograph, never, because and I think this shows the quality of a photographer that can see an image that the everyday bystander can't.
This is a good example of all sorts of different things. First of all, this is believe it or not, my hotel room in a hotel that is built out of an old village in Italy, in the province of Abruzzo, and so they've left a lot of the rustic quality of the buildings intact. So the sort of weathered wall is in fact what they intend to have as the wall in the hotel room. And this particular room had been at one time the place where they would hang meats and sausages from the ceiling, which is why you see those rings on the ceiling. But it's also a great example of what the power of film photography and the power of what film, especially sheet film, can do. So obviously the contrast range of very bright light outdoors and very, very dim light inside, which I've not augmented with any additional light. I think actually maybe now that I say that, there were some very dim room lights on, but nothing much. And with sheet film, in some ways, most of the listeners probably be more tuned into HDR photography, but with sheet film you have some of the same kinds of options. So this piece of film was exposed perhaps a bit more, a little tiny bit of overexposure, and then development that was used to extend the values in the dark areas of the image, and then curtail the development of the highlight values, and then most of my work now, in the early days, of course, I was working in the darkroom exclusively, but now I take these pieces of film and then scan them,
Yeah.
and then manipulate the image in Photoshop, and then print digitally.
Mm.
And so with a negative like this, I have all of the range of detail that I want in the dark areas, and most all of the range of detail that I want in the highlight areas, except for that little tiny crack in between the two shutters. So, and of course I played around with the shutters quite a lot to get the pattern that I wanted on the ceiling and in the little piece of the wall. So
Lovely shot. Lovely shot.
this is another, another example of, one of the things that I think photography does, and it goes back to the fish story from, early on in our conversation, that photography allows you to do something with a subject that isn't really what the subject looks like. So the lighting on each of these three planes, the sort of spiral form in the foreground and the middle ground that's a little bit darker and the background that's darker still, they were all in the same illumination. They're on the facade of a cathedral in Orvieto in Umbria in Italy. And yet in the post-production world, I can take those values and change them at will and create a highlight where I want to highlight and create a shadow where I want to shadow. And perhaps black and white photography is a little bit better at those things than color photography is, because it allows you to do more. And with the large format negative, you've got just all kinds of detail. It's more megapixels than there are pixels in the world. So
when you come to show this at an exhibition, what size print would that be at, Jeff?
Typically about 16 by 20 inches.
Right, okay.
Although in the photograph that's behind me here, in my video window, that's quite a bit larger, like 40 by 60. And I've been making much larger prints, both because the large negative and really high quality scans can support that, but also because there's been increased requests from clients who want bigger prints. Photographs have gotten bigger. People are more interested in bigger photographs than they used to be. So, the bigger the better in a lot of ways. So.
And that size print, would you print that yourself, or would that be printed by a third party?
Typically, something that's really big, I will have printed by a third party. There's a wonderful place here in Chicago called Print Lab that does some work for me, and that I've used on a number of occasions. Now that I'm retired, I no longer have easy access to a very, very large format printer that we had in my department. So I still have some access, but not as much as I used to. So
no, exactly.
Frankly, it's a lot easier and more cost effective for me to just send that to somebody to have it printed. And I have a good relationship with them. And having had that experience in my past of working in a photo lab, I kind of have the back and forth experience of understanding how to communicate with people. So. Yeah, you can go ahead and just flip forward.
Yeah, I was just going to flick forward on this.
Yeah. That's one of the few night photographs.
Yeah, I did see this earlier on, and I was going to ask you, I'm assuming when I saw it that it was a night photograph.
Yeah, and I don't typically photograph these buildings at night, but I happen to have that particular view of the facade of the Pantheon, which was pretty remarkable to have in the first place. So
yeah,
and I happened to be there at night. It was a hotel room, and I literally think it's my favorite building in the whole world, and I stayed up all night just looking at it. It's like when that's 150 feet from your hotel room window, it's hard to
so now
stare at it.
I've been in the Pantheon myself, and it's an amazing building. When you look at it, it just makes you wonder what the ceiling would have looked like before one of the emperors decided to strip it all down.
It's true. It's true.
Unbelievable, isn't it? There's some beautiful architecture in well, myself, I've only been to 2 or 3 cities of Italy, but truly amazing architecture that has stood the test of time in more ways than one.
And as I've worked through this project, not only has my my sort of study of the architecture gotten more broad, and I've learned more about individual architects, and I've so that's the photograph that's
that's the one behind. I just spotted that.
my
Yeah.
video here, but I've also discovered that it's not always the buildings from the greatest architects. It sometimes are little details of something else.
Yes.
It's something that goes largely unnoticed, that may not be the most gifted artisan or the gifted architect, but is just an embellishment on a building that somebody thought through the idea of we've got this this civic building that we need for our public services in the 1400s or the 1500s, and why not make it the most beautiful building in all the provinces around by adding these bits and pieces to it. So that whole attention to detail is really part of what has drawn me to that. But then again, I've also sort of followed the trail of great architects around and seen what they have built in various places, and seen how a lot of the architectural elements that are employed came from France through the Celtic countries. It's just it's like one of those things that the more you study, the more the pit becomes bottomless. So
Yeah, very true, very true.
And the other thing about photographing with a large format camera is that you don't look like every other photographer out there.
No.
Which is sort of like the blessing and the curse, because I've given an awful lot of view camera lessons to people in the world, just because they're standing there trying to figure out why my camera is made out of wood. But also that large camera gives me a kind of entry point into a lot of other people's worlds. People will say, well, if you're interested in this, you should come over here and see this, and you should meet my cousin whose house has a view of that. And ultimately it's brought me into all kinds of private spaces and parts of the world that
I was going to say, because obviously when you're using this camera, you're obviously using tripod, and I was going to ask you, have you had any problems setting up the tripod with such a camera?
Rarely. In the middle of summer in a big city like Rome, sometimes the police officers will ask you to move along with a tripod.
Sure.
And there are permits that you can obtain for tripods. But I've photographed. You just have to be. It's sort of like any time when you interface with authorities of any sort, right? You've got to be polite, and perhaps at the same time politely persistent. So that politeness really helps. But I'm thinking about photographing. Here, this is a tripod photograph. This is some of the color photographs that I made with Hasselblad square equipment back when I was shooting film. Now I shoot a rectangular digital back on the Hasselblad. Another sort of piece to this is if you get up at 5:30 in the morning and walk into Piazza San Marco in Venice, you're pretty much all alone.
Exactly.
There's not going to be anybody there to tell you that you shouldn't set up a tripod. So being in the right place at the right time, or just I'm thinking about having photographed in Pompeii, in the ruins of Pompeii, with a tripod, having this one security guard sort of follow me around, watching me periodically set up the tripod, and then he'd watch me make one picture with the view camera, which takes a few minutes, and then he'd come over and sort of wag his finger at me. Don't forget, you're not really supposed to use a tripod.
Yeah,
but
exactly,
it was it was off season. It was not when there were thousands of people there. He was doing his job, but also recognizing that what I was doing wasn't really that far outside the boundaries. And as long as I said, okay, I'll stop using the tripod, and I'd fold it up and put it under my arm and, walk off, and, he'd walk off in the other direction, and, then later he'd see me and he'd wag us, so you just sort of, it's a dance, that you kind of do.
Mouse around the city. I was going to say, actually, because I was lucky enough to be in Venice this last year, and you're right. The time that we arrived in Venice, we were just there for the day. The place was mobbed until it rained, and then of course
everybody goes inside.
Everyone took
cover.
I
find that if you get up really early and photograph until everybody starts to hit the streets, and then have breakfast.
Yes.
Forgo breakfast until everybody's out on the streets and the light starts to get not as interesting anyway, and get up as early as you possibly can. So I'm excited. I'm taking a workshop group to Venice this in a few weeks, and I'm really looking forward to being there with some people, and also recognizing that a lot of times in Venice, when once you get just like 2 streets off of the main places, it sort of goes
exactly.
It's quiet, tranquil.
It's an amazing.
You keep wandering and you can't get lost because
every lane returns back to you're not going to get lost that way. Actual fact, what you said in actual fact about going out and then go for breakfast is something which a photographer in this country, David Noten, said. Gets up at we'll say 3 o'clock, gets himself ready to do his sunrises and his photography, and then he says, "Well, it's 9 o'clock now. Time to go and get some breakfast." That's it's a great way to do it. That was great, actual fact. Just looking through some of your work there, Jeff, especially your project on stone and the architectural. And I like the way, in actual fact, where you've centered on not centered as such, but you've concentrated on one particular aspect of that architecture, not trying to get the whole of the building in, which is, I suppose, to a degree, an immediate thing which the beginner would want to do.
It's true, and I think that comes from really wanting to look at the way in which these things were made, and so forth and so on. So, and I've been lately branching out a lot into motion. And combining still image and motion, and been very interested in that, and sound, ambient sound, recording a lot of sound in places that I am, so that I can kind of use that sound to kind of help set mood. So that's become interesting to me, and there are so many great tools available to us now, to be able to do those kinds of things, and to work on different ways of pushing imagery out into the world, that relative to the number of people who can see an exhibition of framed images on the wall, I can put images in ebook format or video format or other kinds of formats where I can push images out to a much larger group of people. So those kinds of things are really interesting to me. We're living in probably the most, if we think about it in the historical context, we're living in really the most interesting time in the history of the medium. It's probably much more vibrant than the change from, say, black and white to the availability of color photography in the 1930s. And even before that, the change from photography that could only really be done by people who were dedicating their professional worlds to it in the middle of the 19th century, to the rise of amateurism in the late 19th century and cameras that used dry glass plates or flexible film. We're at this time when this gizmo, is this camera that I'm carrying around with me all the time, regardless, and it now becomes this, I don't know, the tools are so exciting, and the quality of this thing is
That's amazing. I was just talking to a friend,
So
of mine on the last show, Michael Jolliffe, and he's just been down. He lives in Sydney, and he's just been to see an exhibition of iPhone photography, and the print sizes are 10 by 10 inches. He said they are amazing prints. The quality is just superb.
Yep.
But I think we are living in a time, Jeff, where, as you say, I don't think photography probably has ever been so popular. The different outlets that we've got, be it Instagram, Flickr, Google Plus, and the list is endless, with people just posting images. And myself, I love street photography, so to get out on the streets and taking photographs, people don't necessarily worry so much about that as they did maybe even 2-3 years ago, because everyone is taking a photograph of something or someone.
And as a professional photographer, that the idea that everybody's a photographer makes life complicated, difficult,
Sure.
challenging.
Sure.
But it also means that those people who bring greater depth, thought process, understanding to the way in which they're photographing, the story they want to tell, the message they want to communicate, those people have the leg up. That the cameras are so good that anybody can go to the big box store, buy a camera, and pretty much right after the battery is charged up, start making high quality imagery. But it's that soft skill set of
I think the thing which is coming to hand now is with the camera clubs. When you have the judges turn up, the judges are all saying now, look, you got a camera, and there's no reason why any photograph shouldn't be, in terms of reality, shouldn't be out of focus. We're now talking about composition. We're now talking about the skill of using the camera. Now, obviously, there's going to be a time where a photographer wants to deliberately blur a particular style of photography, which is the way the judge has to understand that. But this is where it's getting difficult for that type of work. In the professional world, I quite honestly heard too many people in this country, professionals, that complained about there are too many photographers out there. But as you said, they've got to step up to it. They've got to say, look, I'm a professional. True. I know I'm better than you because I do it for a living. Even though you are taking a wedding photograph and you've got some guy who's a part of the congregation with a 7300 DSLR D4, Nikon D4 taking photographs, your work should be better, and you charge an according price for it.
And repeatable. I have a really good friend who works in the photo industry, has a background as a commercial photographer, and every time he sees a really good quality photograph by someone who may just be starting out, he says, that's really a great photograph.
Exactly.
Now go do it again.
Yeah.
And then do it 100 more times, and don't miss anywhere in between, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's really one of the keys, is being able to repeat that over and over.
Exactly. As we're saying, like the sportsman, it's repeating that shot, it's repeating that day in, day out. And it's not just a flash in the pan, as one would say.
It's true.
Great. Absolutely superb comments there, Jeff. We come to that time of the show where I just want to ask, I'm going to really put you on the spot now. Out of all the photographers that you've spoken about and all your beautiful history lessons that you've given and shared with everyone, who's your favorite photographer?
Eugene Otjay.
Wow.
Eugene Otjay.
Fantastic.
And I'll tell you, I'll telegraph for those. This is my answer to this question. Always. Here's a guy who photographed right around the turn of the century, between the 19th and the 20th century, carried with him some of the sense of 19th century photography and its sort of wonderment that was attached to it. Was using equipment that was sort of out of date at the time that he was using it, but still he was pursuing that, and had a tremendous love for his subject matter. He photographed in and around Paris. He loved Paris. He was concerned that the Paris of his youth was being replaced by the modern Paris that we see today, which it was being. And he wanted to record for posterity what he knew and what he loved. And so from his approach, I take that part, and then from the photographs, I take the part that, man, this guy always knew where to stand.
Exactly.
He always knew where to put the camera.
Yeah.
And it's, my other podcast that's about the creative side of photography, camera position. That's why it's called camera position, because I really think that one of the hardest things that a photographer has to figure out is where to put the camera. And this guy, Eugene Atche, knew where to put the camera just about every time. He never missed.
Amazing photographer. I tell you, when I was in Paris, probably about 3 or 4 years ago, went up the top of the Arc de Triomphe, looking down Champs-Élysées and all the different routes from that, taking it all in. And just under that level, there's a shop, and you buy your little trinkets of Paris, the Eiffel Towers, and there in front of me, I just couldn't believe it, was this book published by Taschen of Eugene. Something like that, and Eugene Atche, and I picked it up and I looked at it and I turned over a couple of pages and it was in English, and I just turned around to my wife and I said, I've got to buy this book. It was €15, and I thought, and it is an amazing book. Amazing. I'm so pleased you mentioned him, because he's probably one photographer which I do forget to mention. You immediately say Cartier-Bresson, you immediately say Brassai or Cortege, or the names roll off, but Eugene Atche, yes, you are so right, so right. Beautiful photographs of Paris, and as you say, the project or the development of his photography was really to remind people of that beautiful part of Paris which was slowly disappearing.
Exactly.
Unbelievable. Superb. Okay, so the next question, but I think I know the answer to this one. Who was your inspiration in photography?
This is and I sort of mentioned someone earlier, but in fact, I'm going to go with another teacher of mine, a guy named Neil Rappaport, and he's no longer living, unfortunately, but he was my graduate school mentor, and he instilled in me an appreciation of photography as an everyday component of one's life, that what one is every day when you get out of bed and put your feet on the floor as a photographer, and you go to sleep as one, and everything in between is really informed by the way in which you look at the world, even when you're not photographing. And his interest in vernacular, in the sort of what everyday people do in their lives to make their lives better or more beautiful or something. And also just his approach to teaching photography, which largely informed my classroom presence during the time that I was teaching formally, which I'm still doing from time to time, teaching in formal classrooms, but now teaching more in my workshop environment and field teaching, which I got a lot, I have a lot of experience in that and do a lot of that anyway. So Neil Rappaport, this wonderful guy, Bennington College in Vermont, who really changed the way I thought of how photography could be in my life and what it was in my life, and that allowed me to kind of really devote a life to photography, sharing my enthusiasm and excitement about the medium with other people. And so he's probably my greatest inspiration, just as a person, as a photographer, as a teacher. So
that's lovely. That's lovely. I did think you were going to say the guy that shook you that time and said,
"No, he was.
Are you for real?"
He was very important. Mulvaney, I still put him on my list of people that I write him periodically and remind him that that's an important thing to do.
Exactly right.
Communicate those messages to those people before they're gone. And let them know how important they've been to your development. As a photographer, as a person, as a professional in whatever field you're in, just let them know.
Fantastic, Jeff. Jeff, it's been an absolute delight talking to you and listening to you talk about not only your projects, but your life.
Great fun.
I'm glad you enjoyed it, and I just want to thank you. Thank you for joining me. All the luck to the Bears.
Next
season.
Next season. Yeah.
Next season.
Yeah.
And good luck to the
Yeah.
teams that are from Chicago in the baseball.
All the Chicago sports teams. We've got a lot of them, and we don't have, we haven't had the greatest. Although lately with the Blackhawks, the hockey team, we've had some success. So perhaps the Bulls this season too. We'll see. But
we'll see how it goes.
Baseball, my beloved Chicago Cubs are the the bad luck team of the of this century and the last.
Well, let's hope a bit of luck comes their way and they change it around. Okay,
right.
Thank you. I'm just going to thank you, Jeff. I'm just going to sign off now, and we'll have a little chat afterwards after I've done the sign off. I just want to say to everyone, if you are going out shooting this weekend, as I always sign off, remember I'm a street photographer myself, so if you are shooting out this weekend, leave your camera bag at home. All the best to you. Bye for now.